It was 2:03 when my phone buzzed, and there it was a voicemail from my mom. Her voice, cold and scripted, told me I was banned from Thanksgiving, that my brother had taken control of everything. I froze. Betrayal, family drama, and secrets all colliding in one moment. I had no idea how deep this went. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. And hey, where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's get into it. The clock glowed 2:03 and my phone buzzed against the nightstand. It wasn't a ring, just that short, sharp vibration that meant voicemail. My stomach dropped instantly. I knew my mom wasn't a night owl. Since Dad had passed, she was usually tucked in with chamomile tea by 9. A call at this hour could only mean something serious. Maybe she'd fallen, maybe a medical emergency, maybe worse. My fingers trembled as I grabbed the phone, the screen blinding in the dark, and saw the notification. Mom. New voicemail. I hesitated for a split second, heart hammering, and then pressed play. Her voice came through. And it wasn't the mom I knew. It was flat, distant, cold, not warm, not concerned, just icy. Like it had been practiced, like someone had coached her every word. She didn't call me Lizzie, didn't soften it with honey or sweetheart. It was just, Elizabeth, I am calling to inform you. Her tone was brittle, almost mechanical. My chest tightened. Something was very wrong. I sank into the pillows, trying to understand. The words hit me slowly at first. Then in a rush, I was not welcome at Thanksgiving or Christmas. Julian had secured her finances. They were removing me from everything accounts, the estate, power of attorney. My mind spun. I'd always thought our family drama was messy but manageable. I'd assumed I knew the battlefield. But this was new and terrifying. The apartment felt suddenly colder. The duvet slipped from my chest as I sat up. Trying to process it, I could hear her reading from a script, papers rustling in the background. And then, a murmur, a deep male voice, Julian, coaching her. That's when it clicked. He wasn't just some casual presence in her life. He was directing this, manipulating her, and I was the target. My heart raced, every beat loud in the silence of the room. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Years of managing complex estates and high-stakes financial crises had trained me to compartmentalize. My brain went into survival mode. But the shock was there. A sharp, sudden stab that left my hands trembling and my chest tight. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was an attempt to strip me of control, to rewrite the reality of my life overnight. I leaned back against the headboard, rubbing my face, trying to collect my thoughts. Patricia, my mom, wasn't reckless. She'd always been careful, kind, soft-hearted, but the grief after Dad's sudden death had left her vulnerable. Julian had swooped in, and she, in her fragile state, had apparently handed him the reins, or at least that was what the voicemail suggested. The words kept replaying in my head. We are removing you from everything. The phrase was simple, clinical, devastating. It sounded like a verdict, a sentence, and Julian, the quiet manipulator, had orchestrated it. I thought back to our family history. Dad had passed unexpectedly 5 years ago, and Mom had disappeared into grief. She stopped eating, stopped paying bills, stopped living. I had dropped everything to move back, to manage her life, her home, her finances. I had cleaned up the chaos, handled the bills, ensured she could live safely. And now she sounded like she was accusing me of control, of greed, as if the years I spent caring for her had been a lie in her mind. My stomach churned, a mix of disbelief, hurt, and cold fury. The silence of the room pressed in, heavy and almost suffocating. The voicemail ended with a sharp click, leaving only the echo of betrayal. I held the phone in my hand, staring at it as if it could explain itself, as if I could rewind, pause, and make sense of the impossible. The tension in my chest didn't ease. Julian's presence loomed larger than ever, even in that brief audio snippet. He had stepped in, positioned himself as the savior, and turned my own mother against me, all under the guise of freedom and independence. I forced myself to breathe, slow, deliberate breaths. My apartment was dark, the city skyline outside indifferent, glittering miles away. I whispered the word out loud, more to anchor myself than anything else. Free. She thought Julian had saved her, thought she was cutting me out, but she had no idea. She didn't see the legal structure, the protections, the absolute control I had over the assets. She didn't know the hand she had just tried to bite. The dread was raw, but beneath it simmered clarity. I wasn't helpless. I understood the rules, the trust, the estate. My father had been meticulous, almost paranoid in securing it, and now, in the darkness of 2:03 a.m., amidst the shock and betrayal, I realized the real game had begun. Julian thought he was clever. Mom thought she was making a choice. And I had just woken up to the first move in a battle I hadn't yet fought. But when I was fully capable of winning, I sat on the edge of the bed, phone still in hand, letting the voicemail replay in my head. At first, it was all panic and disbelief, that icy, scripted voice echoing in the dark room. But then, slowly, my mind shifted gears. Years of working in high-stakes finance had trained me for moments exactly like this, chaotic, messy, full of emotion, but requiring clarity. I forced myself to breathe, to slow down, and to think like I would in the office during a market crisis. Not like a daughter hearing her mother declare war at 2 a.m. I started breaking it down. Patricia Mom was acting on a fundamental misunderstanding. She thought Julian had secured her finances and was taking over everything. But she didn't understand the structure Dad had built, the fortress he'd created around the estate and the family's assets. And, honestly, she had never been one to read the fine print. She'd always been trusting, kind, too generous for her own good. My father had known this and had acted accordingly. He wasn't just leaving her in charge. He had created an irrevocable trust. And I was the sole trustee. I remembered the trust documents like a second language. The Harrison Family Trust. Everything of real value: house, cars, accounts, investments was not technically in Mom's name. Not a single thing. She could live in the house, drive the car, and use the accounts. Sure. But legally, absolutely none of it was hers. All of it belonged to the trust. And I, Elizabeth Harrison, had absolute discretion as trustee. Dad had anticipated a million scenarios, and in each, I would be the safeguard. He'd been brilliant, meticulous, sometimes paranoid. But now, in the middle of this betrayal, that paranoia was my armor. I ran through the voicemail again, in my head, piece by piece. Julian had convinced her she was finally free. He had manipulated her grief, her vulnerability, and painted me as a controlling, greedy daughter. and she had bought it. It was shocking. My heart thudded not from fear, but from the pure audacity of it all. Years of caring for her, keeping her safe, managing the chaos she couldn't handle. And she had been persuaded in the blink of an eye that I was the villain. I pushed the duvet off and swung my legs onto the floor. The room was cold, but I barely noticed. I needed to act. First, coffee. Black. Strong enough to wake the dead, and in that quiet pre-dawn hour, I brewed it while my thoughts swirled. The hiss and gurgle of the machine somehow steadied me. I poured it into my favorite mug, the one with the tiny chip on the rim Dad had made a joke about decades ago. The first sip was bitter, sharp, and it was exactly what I needed. My laptop sat on the dining table, already open. I hovered over the keyboard, my mind scanning options, assessing threats, calculating moves. I needed to secure the estate before Julian could even think of making his next move. The hurt, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all condensed into a cold, clear clarity. Julian had made a mistake. They had assumed that because I managed the money belonged to Mom. They had assumed that because she lived in the house, she owned it, but Dad had structured everything perfectly, irreversibly. They had no idea, and that was my advantage. The first call went to Megan, my best friend since law school and the one person who fully understood the trust structure and the protective measures Dad had built. She was a corporate shark, the kind of person who ate breach of contract cases for breakfast. Her voice was raspy, alert even at this early hour. I briefed her quickly, calmly. I told her about the voicemail, about Julian, about Mom's sudden declaration of independence. She exhaled, already processing. She realizes the trust is irrevocable. Right. We wrote it that way, specifically for this scenario. I nodded, knowing full well that they didn't. The realization alone gave me a strategic edge. Next, the security company. I gave them precise instructions: reset the alarms, remove all guest codes, flag Julian as unauthorized. If the alarm triggered, do not call the house, call the police. I needed physical security as tight as financial security. And then, the bank. I queued up transfer requests online, moving the operating capital back into the main trust account. Not stealing, not punishing Mom, just securing what was legally and rightfully under the trust. I left the account at zero, every dollar accounted for, every risk mitigated, and finally, the credit card company. The supplementary card I'd issued to Mom for emergencies, now compromised, freeze it, effective immediately. All in place before dawn, as the caffeine coursed through my veins, the adrenaline mingling with it. I allowed myself a grim smile. Julian thought he was clever, that he had manipulated Mom into thinking she was cutting me out. But he had forgotten one critical fact: you don't bite the hand that feeds you. Especially when that hand is the only thing holding the roof over your head. My father had prepared for every eventuality, and I was executing the plan he had set in motion. One meticulous step at a time, I let myself replay memories, not to dwell on pain, but to understand the context of the betrayal. 5 years ago, after Dad's sudden death, Mom had collapsed under grief. She had stopped eating, stopped bathing, stopped living fully. I had moved back into the guest room. For 6 months, sorting mail, paying bills, attending her medical appointments, and holding her up when she couldn't stand on her own. I hadn't done it to control her. I had done it out of love. Now, to hear her treat me like a criminal, like a manipulator, was a shock. But that shock was being transformed slowly into focus, into strategy. I started listing Julian in my mind, recalling everything I knew. The man who had appeared at the charity gala, charming, confident, sly, trying to take advantage of a grieving widow. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I already knew his identity, his claims, his tactics. They were all within my grasp, and my first moves had already been executed. Security tightened, funds secured, credit lines frozen, every step deliberate, controlled, precise, no panic, just action. The sun was beginning to hint at the horizon, a pale purple and orange bleeding into the sky, and I felt a calm settle over me. The chaos of the voicemail, the manipulation, the apparent betrayal, it was still shocking, but it no longer controlled me. I was in control. The estate was secure, Mom was protected. Julian's confidence, carefully built on ignorance and deceit, was about to meet reality, and I was ready, calm, prepared, and deadly focused. The night had revealed the threat, but it had also revealed the power structure I had inherited, the defenses Dad had built, and the clear, cold path to protect everything that mattered. I sat back, sipping my coffee, the bitter warmth grounding me. The game had begun, and I was already 3 moves ahead. By the first light of dawn, the pattern had become clear. My mother, usually meticulous about our lunches and weekend check-ins, had started canceling without explanation. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue or lingering grief, but the excuses grew stranger, more insistent, always accompanied by subtle justifications she'd echo from Julian. I could hear his influence in every word. "Elizabeth, you work too hard," she'd say, almost verbatim, repeating phrases I knew weren't her own. Families shouldn't control family money. I froze the first few times, thinking maybe I was overreacting, but the pattern hardened into a strategy. Julian's voice, running through hers like a ghost in the room. It wasn't just words. It was the micro adjustments, the slight hesitations, the way she started deferring to him on small decisions, what landscapers to hire, which grocery items were worth buying, even the timing of her own appointments. The subtlety was infuriating. I'd been by her side for 5 years, managing her finances, her estate, her life, and now it was being undermined quietly, insidiously. Julian was painting himself as a savior, a knowledgeable, reassuring presence, while I was being recast as the controlling daughter. Every missed lunch, every echoed phrase, every subtle nudge chipped away at the reality I had spent years constructing. By 4:15, I knew the game had escalated beyond passive manipulation. Julian wasn't just influencing Mom. He was actively positioning himself to seize assets and control. I needed to act, and I needed to act decisively, calm, measured, deliberate. Panic would be a luxury I couldn't afford. I dialed the high-end security firm monitoring the estate. My voice steadied despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "This is Elizabeth Harrison, passcode Alpha 9. Victor, update the access list immediately. Remove all guest codes. Reset the alarm and flag Julian as unauthorized. If triggered, call the police. Do not call the house." Every word was precise, leaving no room for error. The operator's pause betrayed a hint of surprise, but they followed instructions without question. Next was the bank. I couldn't call until they opened at 7. But that didn't stop me from preparing transfer requests online, operating capital groceries, utilities, incidental spending all had to be secured. I moved every dollar into the main trust account. It was cold, clinical, almost cruel in execution, but necessary. Julian had already overestimated his control, and I would use that assumption against him. Every transaction carefully logged, every account secured. The platinum AMX card Mom used, the supplementary card I had issued for emergencies, was compromised by design now. I froze it, not to punish her, not to assert dominance, but to prevent Julian from exploiting the slightest access she still had. It was a chess move, set in stone before the sun even rose, while the digital fortress went up. I kept replaying those small patterns in my head. A forensic reconstruction of Julian's influence, how he had slid into her world in barely 2 months. How quickly she had begun echoing his language, parroting his rationalizations. The man had charisma, sure, but it was a veneer over incompetence and opportunism. He spoke in buzzwords, investment jargon, terms that sounded sophisticated but were empty. And Mom, in her vulnerability, was absorbing every syllable, convinced he had her best interests at heart. I recognized the playbook immediately. Isolation, repetition, micro-influences, all designed to make her doubt me and rely on him. It was textbook manipulation, but I wasn't blind to it. And this time, the board was set, and I was in control. The calls and online transfers were just the beginning. Every action needed timing, precision, and the element of inevitability. I envisioned the upcoming confrontation, a strategic dance that would ensure Julian could not recover or gain advantage. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, eyes scanning account balances, access logs, and passwords. The security system had been updated, the bank transfers queued, and the cards frozen. I knew every line of defense had to be airtight. He might have convinced Mom he was indispensable, but he had no idea what I was capable of. The quiet pre-dawn hours were mine, and I intended to make them count. Megan, always reliable and always sharp, became my sounding board and amplifier. Her calm, calculated presence grounded me. She understood that this wasn't just about money, it was about leverage, control, and perception. I explained the situation succinctly, and she already anticipated my next steps. We need to control the narrative and the assets simultaneously. She said, if you delay, Julian will spin this. He'll tell her you're lying, bullying, manipulating. She was right. Speed and precision were crucial. No hesitation, no emotional overreach. We had to act in lockstep, and that meant every call, every freeze, every digital transfer had to be executed before the sun fully rose and before Julian could orchestrate his next move. I remembered the voicemail, the cold, hollow tone, the way Julian's murmurs underscored the threat. Every word replayed in my head. But this time, it wasn't panic or hurt dominating my thoughts. It was strategy. He had made assumptions that I would be reactive, that I might hesitate, that my focus would waver. He was wrong. And I had a system, a plan, and every tool necessary to ensure that he could not advance without consequence. I began mapping it out mentally, secure the estate, lock access, control perception, and gather evidence. Each piece fit into a larger whole, a defensive architecture designed to protect Mom and the assets, and ultimately, to expose Julian's manipulations. I paused, sipping black coffee, letting its bitterness sharpen my focus. There was a cruel satisfaction in the clarity that came with knowing the truth Julian had overplayed his hand. He didn't understand the legal scaffolding of the trust, the extent of my authority, or the fact that I could respond with the precision of someone who had dedicated her career to preventing exactly this type of financial exploitation. I smiled, humorless, as I envisioned the dominoes falling in sequence. Security lockdowns, frozen accounts, restricted access, all of it ensured that by the time Julian fully realized his maneuver, it would be too late. And then there was Mom. I felt the sting of betrayal again. Yes, but tempered by the knowledge that she was still my responsibility, still under my protection. Every decision I made needed to balance legality with care. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was acting as trustee, as protector, as the only person fully aware of the stakes. The voicemail had been a siren, yes, a shock to the system, but it had also clarified the battlefield. Julian had made his first move. Now it was my turn, and I was 3 steps ahead. Calm, deliberate, precise. The pre-dawn quiet was my ally, the coffee, my fuel, the trust, my armor. By the time the city fully awoke, I would be ready for whatever he attempted next, armed with every precaution, every contingency, every piece of the puzzle aligned perfectly for the confrontation that had already begun in whispers and manipulations during those missed lunch dates. I sat at my desk, coffee cooling beside me, eyes fixed on the screen. Julian. The name sounded harmless enough, even polished. But after the voicemail, after seeing Mom's confusion, I needed to know exactly who he was. I started with the basics, running his name through state licensing boards, national broker databases, any corporate filings I could access. Nothing. Not a trace. Okay, suspicious. Then I looked at the company he claimed to own, Vance Global Holdings. Dissolved, involuntary dissolution, failure to pay taxes. That explained a lot. So much for being a successful developer. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes, letting the pieces settle. Years of forensic accounting had trained me to see patterns where others saw chaos. Sloppy filings, dissolved companies, blank records where there should have been a trail, all pointed to the same conclusion. Julian wasn't a tycoon. He wasn't building an empire. He was moving through life with opportunistic charm, a low-level grifter, hoping no one would notice the gaps. I pulled up a photo from Mom's Facebook page. That tacky gold watch he wore, a limited edition knockoff. I frowned. Zooming in, tracing the details. Not a flashy lie, but a tell. Men like him, con men like him, were always obsessed with appearances. Every detail, from the dissolved company to the fake watch, lined up like a breadcrumb trail leading straight to him. My curiosity sharpened. I had to know the full picture. Next, the incorporation documents. Buried deep in the PDF was a co-signer, Monica Vance. A divorce filing popped up almost instantly. Vance versus Vance. 3 years ago in Arizona. Jackpot. I read through the decree. Allegations of financial dissipation, drained retirement accounts, funding of imaginary investments. And then it hit me. Julian's legal name wasn't Vance, it was Julian Vancetti. That little tweak, that extra layer of identity, explained the inconsistencies, the carefully crafted persona, the illusion of legitimacy he'd projected to Mom. I didn't stop there. Julian Vancetti, criminal database, fraud by deception dismissed, theft by conversion settled, passing bad checks probation, I sat back, letting the information sink in. Every record, every filing, every judgment added color to the picture I was constructing. He wasn't some slick developer, he was a small-time predator, moving from one vulnerable target to the next. The tension tightened in my chest, a mix of disbelief, irritation, and grim satisfaction. This wasn't guesswork. This was documented history. I needed corroboration, something that tied him directly to the manipulations in my mother's life. That's when I reached out to Monica, hesitant at first. She agreed to speak when I explained the situation. She sent a video affidavit, short, sharp, and devastatingly clear. She detailed exactly how Julian had ruined her credit, stolen jewelry, forged signatures, and preyed on her trust. Watching it, I felt that familiar mix of horror and clarity, the pieces finally clicking together. The man I'd been studying wasn't a mystery anymore. He was a con man, and I had the evidence in my hands. The slow reveal of his past, piece by piece, made my heart pound not from fear, but from the intensity of realization. Dissolved companies, empty filings, criminal records. The ex-wife's affidavit all painted the same story. Julian had been operating for years, carefully constructing an image of wealth and competence while leaving a trail of victims. And now, he was in my mother's house, spinning lies, convincing her that I was the controlling party, that he was her savior. It was audacious, infuriating, and entirely predictable. I let myself react just a little, a quiet, humorless laugh. The audacity of the man, the sheer confidence he carried while hiding such a weak, corrupt foundation, it was almost poetic. And I had every tool I needed to dismantle it. Knowledge was leverage, and I held the entire set. Each record, each piece of corroboration, each small discrepancy was a weapon. Julian had underestimated one crucial thing. I saw the patterns. I understood the structures. I could trace his moves before he even made them. By the time the sun climbed high, indifferent to the human drama unfolding, I had a complete map. He was a fraud. A small-time con man who thought charm and buzzwords could override legality and loyalty. And he had just made a critical error underestimating me. The tension remained, but it was now controlled, disciplined. Every fact, every record, every affidavit became a step in the plan to protect my mother and expose him. Curiosity had led me to the truth. And the truth gave me power. Julian's empire of illusions was about to meet reality, and I was ready. The country club was stunning that evening, a fortress of limestone bathed in the soft golden glow of autumn lights. Valets in crisp white jackets dashed back and forth, parking Jaguars and Mercedes, while a string quartet's melodies floated through the open French doors. It was a world of elegance, of old money, of careful appearances, and right in the center of it all, sitting at the head of table one, was Julian, perfectly composed. Exactly the part he wanted to play, charming, confident, untouchable. I parked a few feet from the entrance, ignoring the valet who reached for my door handle. "Keep it close, Jerry," I said, handing him a $20 bill. I wasn't staying long enough to fuss about parking. My heels clicked against the marble staircase as I ascended, each step echoing in my ears, matching the drum of adrenaline in my chest. My leather portfolio was tucked under my arm, filled with evidence, every piece painstakingly compiled over the past week. The plan was clear: expose him, protect Mom, and do it all publicly. The ballroom was alive with chatter, laughter, the clinking of glasses, the quiet rustle of expensive fabrics. But the moment I stepped in, the atmosphere shifted. People turned, their faces registering recognition, shock, curiosity. Gossip in this town traveled faster than the speed of sound, and everyone here knew, even if only vaguely, that something was brewing. The whispers rose like a tide, but I ignored them, focused entirely on Julian and the woman next to him, my mother, Patricia. She looked smaller than ever, the emerald gown she'd chosen clinging to her, but unable to hide the slump of her posture, the tension in her shoulders, the brittle tightness of her smile. She looked like a trophy, fragile and manipulated, and my blood ran cold for a moment. Julian, however, didn't notice, or at least he acted as if he didn't. One hand on the back of her chair, the other holding a champagne flute. He laughed at some story the club president, Mr. Henderson, was telling. It was infuriating. That arrogance, that smug confidence, it was exactly what I needed to pierce. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of nerves and anticipation, and stepped forward. Each click of my heels was a drumbeat, a signal that the confrontation had begun. I stopped directly across from them. Julian's smile remained fixed, but his eyes flickered ever so slightly. He knew something was coming. "Elizabeth?" Mr. Henderson said, surprised. "We didn't expect to see you." I ignored him, projecting my voice clearly across the room. "I wasn't invited," I said evenly, but I couldn't miss the performance. The crowd began to lean in, sensing the tension, the invisible line about to snap. Julian sipped his champagne, trying to maintain his alpha facade. "Elizabeth, I assume you're here to apologize. Patricia and I are just trying to enjoy a nice evening," he said smoothly, the kind of false charm he always wielded. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze with a calm precision, my own voice, carrying just enough sharpness to cut through the ambient music. "I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to present a report." I opened my portfolio and pulled out the first document, the quitclaim deed. The paper rested heavily in my hand, the evidence of his overreach tangible. I dropped it onto the white tablecloth between crystal glasses. The room seemed to go quiet, the strings of the quartet fading into an almost imperceptible hum. "Tell me, Julian," I said, my voice steady, measured. "Why is a title to the family cabin in the name of Vance Global Holdings, as of yesterday afternoon, a company that, according to the Nevada Secretary of State, was dissolved 3 years ago for tax fraud?" Eyes widened around the table. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, peering at the document, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. Julian's jaw tightened. "That is a private business arrangement," he said quickly, his voice forced. "Patricia and I are restructuring her assets for tax efficiency. You wouldn't understand. You're just an accountant." I inhaled slowly, letting the room absorb the gravity of his words. "I am a forensic accountant," I said, leaning slightly forward, eyes locked on his. "And I understand perfectly. It's called commingling funds. It's called theft by deception." The room shifted, a subtle but noticeable collective intake of breath. Heads turned, glasses paused mid-air, and the soft hum of conversation died down. I reached for the next piece, the criminal background report. Thick, weighty, undeniable. I placed it next to the deed. "And this," I said, my voice dropping slightly, deliberate, "is your curriculum, Vance bad checks in Ohio, 2018, insurance fraud in Arizona, 2021, and a restraining order filed by Monica Vancetti 3 years ago." Julian's face paled slightly, his composure cracking in microseconds that the trained eye could see. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The string quartet stopped. The entire ballroom's attention snapped to us. Silence was absolute. Julian's mask of charm faltered. The confident alpha was gone. "These are lies," he shouted, voice rising, veins bulging in his neck. "Patricia, look at me. She forged these documents. She's trying to destroy us because she wants your money." My mother's eyes darted between us, panic threading her expression. Her hands tightened on the chair's edge, nails pressing into the fabric, and for a moment, she seemed frozen, trapped in the space between confusion and realization. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm, measured, terrifyingly even. "Actually," I said, "we have the security footage of you leaving the house with the maritime paintings at 1:45 p.m. today. Those paintings are property of the Harrison Family Trust. You are not a beneficiary, Mr. Vancetti, and removing them constitutes grand larceny. The value exceeds $100,000, making this a Class B felony." I gestured toward the main doors. The 2 uniformed officers I had called from the parking lot 10 minutes earlier were entering, guided by the club manager. Julian looked first at the cops, then at the French doors leading to the patio. For a moment, I thought he might run, but he slumped, the arrogance collapsing under the weight of exposure. The officers approached, cuffed him, reciting his rights in front of the town's elite. He hadn't even realized he was surrounded by witnesses, evidence, and the law itself. I turned to Mom. She sat frozen, tears streaking silently down her face, ruining her makeup. Her eyes went to the empty space Julian had occupied, then to the documents, and finally, to me. I knelt beside her, taking her hand, cold but real in mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice breaking. "Lizzie, I'm so sorry." "I know," I said softly, squeezing her hand. "Let's go home." "Mom." The nightmare was over. But the lessons lingered. Julian had been exposed, the assets secured, and the emotional stakes laid bare. The drama, public and personal, had reached its peak, and in that ballroom, amid crystal chandeliers and whispered gossip, justice, careful and precise, had been delivered. The night had ended, and with it, Julian's reign of deception, finally unmasked and stopped. The aftermath of the gala was surreal. Julian was in cuffs, the officers leading him through the grand entrance, while whispers and shocked glances followed him out. It was satisfying. Sure, seeing the man who had manipulated my mother finally confronted by the law, but there was a hollowness too. The real work wasn't over. Justice on paper was one thing, repairing the damage, protecting Mom. That was another. The paintings, her diamond necklace, the watch's recovery was surprisingly straightforward. The security footage confirmed everything. The boxes Julian had taken from the house traced to his exit, and the items were returned intact. But her heart, her sense of safety, Her trust, those couldn't be counted or transferred. I found her in the sunroom the next morning. The light filtered through the curtains, soft and forgiving. But she sat quietly, staring at the garden. The house was quiet, the chaos of Julian's intrusion lingering like a shadow in the corners. We had changed the locks, cleaned the guest room, secured every point of entry, but her vulnerability was palpable. I sat beside her without saying anything at first, letting the silence bridge the gap between the traumatic events and our fragile reality. She turned slightly, eyes wet, still processing. "I feel so stupid," she whispered. I let him in. I believed him. I betrayed Dad's memory by letting a grifter sleep in his bed, drive his car. Her voice was small, tremulous, filled with regret. I reached out and took her hand gently, feeling the chill of worry and fear in her skin. "Mom," I said softly, "you didn't betray anyone? He exploited your grief, your kindness. That's on him, not you." Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she leaned into my shoulder, the tension in her body easing just slightly. It wasn't a sudden fix, there never is, but it was a start. We talked quietly for hours. I didn't hire a nurse, a therapist, or anyone else to step in. I just stayed, made her coffee, answered the phone calls from concerned neighbors, sorted the mail, and simply listened. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Sometimes the presence alone, the steady assurance that she was safe, was enough to begin the slow process of healing. She spoke occasionally, haltingly, about the loneliness she'd felt after Dad died and how, over the years, she had slowly become invisible in her own house. The work I had done, the time I had invested, she admitted had made her feel seen, valued, even loved. But Julian had preyed on the empty spaces, the moments of insecurity, the gaps of grief. He had filled them with lies and manipulation, convincing her she was finally free by cutting me out. And now, sitting together in the quiet of the sunroom, the truth laid bare, the danger past. We were beginning the work of reclaiming those spaces, rebuilding trust, and acknowledging the pain without letting it define us. I reflected on the lessons this ordeal had imparted: protecting the money, securing the assets, ensuring the estate was safe. That was one thing, and I had done it with precision. But protecting the person, the human being behind the accounts and property, that required something deeper: emotional vigilance, presence, empathy, and patience. Money could be traced, recovered, locked down, or frozen. The heart, the mind, the sense of self that couldn't be secured with passwords or legal documents. That required being there, fully, without judgment or resentment. Over the following days, we re-established routines, slow and careful. Breakfast together in the kitchen, tea in the sunroom, walks in the garden. She started to laugh again, a small, shaky sound that gradually gained volume and warmth. We talked about Dad, about Julian, about mistakes and learning, and we updated the trust, ensuring she understood every detail, giving her the knowledge and tools to participate, to feel empowered rather than powerless. It was a reversal of roles. In some ways she wanted to learn, to understand the money, to manage alongside me rather than be protected from it. And I was ready, patient, willing to teach. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the garden, she reached out and touched my face gently. "You saved me," she said simply. No dramatics, no embellishment, just truth. I smiled, lightly, feeling the lump in my throat. I tried, I said weakly, with a hint of humor, trying to lighten the gravity. She chuckled, a wet, shaky sound, but real. And we sat together, just being, the house calm around us. Weeks passed. Thanksgiving arrived, 3 weeks later. It wasn't the grand celebration she had originally planned. No extended family, no country club gala. Just the two of us in the dining room, a smaller table by the window. The oppressive tension of the last months lifted just enough to breathe. I had cooked badly, I admit, but the turkey was edible, the wine excellent, and that was enough. Enough to mark survival, triumph, and the beginning of something new. As we finished dessert, she reached under the table and pulled out a small, flat box. "I have something for you," she said. Inside was not jewelry, but a framed legal document. Amendment to the Harrison Family Trust. Designation of co-trustee. She had read it fully this time and wanted to participate, to manage alongside me. Her eyes met mine, steady, focused, determined. She wasn't the helpless widow anymore. She was bruised, yes, but rebuilding. Taking responsibility, owning her space and her power. We clinked glasses. A small toast to independence reclaimed the very word Julian had tried to weaponize against us. But this time, it was ours, protected, understood, and embraced. I realized fully then that the lessons weren't just about legal documents or frozen accounts or recovering stolen property. They were about vigilance, empathy, patience, and the understanding that the people you love need protection as much as the money they own. And that if anyone ever tried to come for my family again, they wouldn't just be facing a daughter. They would be facing a trustee who had learned that safeguarding hearts was as critical as safeguarding assets. The nightmare was over. Julian was in a cell, facing justice for his actions. My mother was safe, empowered, learning, and engaged. And I, finally, had learned a lesson too. Protecting money wasn't enough. Protecting the person, nurturing trust, being present. These were the real responsibilities. And in that quiet dining room, with the sun casting gentle light across the table, with the turkey slightly overcooked and wine perfectly poured, I knew we had won more than a legal battle. We had won back the trust, the bond, and the fragile but unbreakable sense of family. In the end, Julian was caught, the estate secured, and my mother safe and empowered. We learned that protecting money isn't enough. You have to protect the people you love too. It was a lesson in vigilance, trust, and resilience. One that reshaped our relationship and our understanding of family. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like and subscribe to see more real-life tales of strategy, courage, and the lengths people go to protect what matters most.